When I saw my husband scrolling through my phone, my heart skipped a beat, not out of fear of being caught, but because of those messages. The ones I had forgotten to delete. I reached to snatch the phone from his hands, but he pulled it back quickly, his eyes fixed on the screen. I watched his face change as he read line after line, and I felt my world unraveling in seconds. Yes, he was about to learn the truth. But not all of it. His hands trembled as he scrolled further, and I knew he was getting closer to that message. The one that would destroy my life. The one that would either explain everything or make it even worse. My phone suddenly buzzed in his hand, and a new notification appeared on the screen. I saw his face pale when he read the sender's name. He froze. Didn't even blink. I bit the inside of my cheek, an old habit when I panic. My nerves were colliding with the terror of what I had done. His breathing grew heavier. I could hear it even across the 2 feet separating us. This was exactly what I had feared most. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake that changed absolutely everything, and now. I didn't know what to do, but let me tell you how it all really happened. Before I share the secret I've been desperately trying to bury for so long, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, and answer one question. Have you ever had a secret you tried so hard to hide, only to fail in the end? I don't know the exact moment when I stopped being a wife and started being a ghost in my own home. Maybe it was the 3rd business trip in a row, or maybe it was the way my husband's eyes stopped meeting mine at breakfast. The truth is, nothing dramatic happened. No fights, no screaming matches. Just silence. A long, growing silence that stretched over our dinners, our weekends, our bed. It's strange how emptiness can be so loud. When the house is quiet for too long, you start talking to yourself. Not out loud, of course. But in your head. You rehearse conversations that never happen. Apologies that are never offered. Fantasies that flicker and fade before they even begin. That's where I was, suspended in the in-between. Too loyal to leave, too lonely to stay the same. He had left that morning without a kiss. Just a note on the counter, gone to the airport. Back Thursday. Love you. 3 lines. I stared at them like they were written in a foreign language. There was something oddly final about them, as if the love you was an obligation, a sign-off rather than a feeling. I crumpled the paper and tossed it without thinking. The day unfolded like most others. Laundry. Emails. Grocery run. But I couldn't shake the thought that my life had become a series of scheduled tasks designed to keep me from thinking too much. I tried reading. I tried yoga. I tried making pasta from scratch. None of it worked. I still felt that itch under my skin, the kind that no amount of routine could numb. It was around 4 in the afternoon when the phone rang. I recognized the number before I saw the name. My father-in-law. He never called without a reason. Hi, I answered, a little too quickly. I cleared my throat. Everything okay? Of course, he said. His voice was warm, familiar. I'm sorting through some tax papers and I could use a second pair of eyes. If you're not busy. I wasn't. Of course, I wasn't. I told him I'd be there in 30 minutes. The drive was short but felt longer. Not because of traffic, but because of the anticipation. There was no reason to feel nervous, and yet my palms were sweaty on the steering wheel. I hadn't been to his house alone in years. It used to be filled with laughter and family dinners. Now it was just him, a widower, quiet, private. He greeted me at the door with a smile that reached his eyes. I had forgotten what that looked like. Inside, the house was exactly how I remembered, but quieter. Dust had settled on framed photographs, and the kitchen smelled faintly of lavender and old wood. He poured us both a cup of coffee before we even sat down at the table. We talked about numbers, receipts, tax codes. But eventually the conversation drifted, as it always does when two lonely people are in the same room for too long. He asked me how I was. Not in the casual, polite way, but like he actually wanted to know. "I'm fine," I said. Then added, "just tired." He didn't push, but he didn't nod and move on either. He looked at me like he could see past the smile I wore like armor. "I've been meaning to clean out the guest room," he said at one point. "It still looks exactly like she left it." I glanced toward the hallway, imagining the room, floral curtains, soft bedding, photographs on the nightstand. I had always liked that room. "You don't have to," I said. "I know," he replied. "But maybe I do." There was a pause. One of those heavy, meaningful silences that don't feel awkward, just honest. "Thank you for coming," he said. "It's nothing," I replied. "Really?" But it wasn't nothing. Not to me. I left before sunset. The air outside was cooler than I expected, and I wrapped my cardigan tighter around me as I walked to the car. For a brief moment, I wondered if he was watching me from the window. And for another brief moment, I hoped he was. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the refrigerator in the next room. I thought about the way he had looked at me. Not inappropriately. Just attentively. As if I were still visible. Still a woman. Still worth listening to. My husband texted around midnight. Just as simple, landed safely. I typed a response, deleted it, then typed it again. Finally, I just sent, "Okay. Good night." I turned off the lamp and lay in the dark, wondering when I had become someone who needed validation from anyone other than the man I married. And wondering, quietly, dangerously, if maybe I had already crossed a line. The next day began as if nothing had happened, and perhaps that was the strangest part of all. I woke up, made coffee, watered the plants, and folded the laundry. A mechanical rhythm carried me from task to task, but beneath the surface, my mind was spinning like a top. I kept replaying yesterday's visit in my head, as though it were a film I wasn't sure how to interpret. Every glance, every pause, every word felt loaded now. Was I imagining things? Had I projected something that wasn't there? Or was it all very real, and I just wasn't ready to admit it? At noon, I got a text. From him. "Thank you for helping yesterday. It meant a lot." 8 words. Simple. Innocent. Yet I read them over a dozen times, trying to decipher if the last 3 carried the weight I suspected. I typed a reply. "Of course. It was good to see you." Then deleted it. Then wrote it again. Sent it. An hour later, he responded. "Would you like to come by later for tea?" I stared at the screen, heart suddenly louder than it had been in weeks. I didn't answer right away. I told myself to wait, to think. But even as I told myself to be cautious, I was already brushing my hair and choosing a blouse that felt a little softer, a little more flattering than what I'd usually wear on a weekday. It was a pale blue, silk-like, slightly loose. Nothing dramatic. But when I looked at myself in the mirror, I noticed something I hadn't seen in a long time, a faint lift in my expression, a flicker of awareness in my own eyes. The drive over was calmer than the last time. I even hummed along to the radio, fingers tapping the steering wheel. It was odd how easily comfort could grow between two people who were never meant to find it in each other. When I arrived, he opened the door with a small smile. Not a smirk, not a grin, just something warm, familiar. The living room looked brighter, somehow. He had opened the windows, letting in the late afternoon light. A plate of biscuits sat on the table, 2 cups already poured. He didn't reach for my coat or compliment my outfit. He just gestured to the armchair and said, "Sit. Please." We talked about simple things. Books. Weather. How difficult it was to find decent plums this year. And then, somewhere between the second sip and the third silence, something shifted. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. "You seemed different yesterday." I paused, cup midair. "Different how?" He shrugged gently. "Lighter. Like something had lifted off your shoulders." I didn't answer immediately. I looked down, watching the steam curl from my cup. Then, without really meaning to, I said, "Maybe it's because someone finally saw me." The words hung in the air longer than I wanted. I regretted them the moment they left my mouth, but I didn't take them back. I couldn't. He didn't look shocked. He didn't avert his gaze. He just nodded, slow and understanding. "I felt invisible too," he said. That silence returned, the one we both seemed to recognize now. Heavy, yes, but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence where truths live. The kind that doesn't beg to be filled. After a while, I stood. "I should go." He didn't protest. Just walked me to the door, hands in his pockets. The evening light filtered across his face, catching the faint lines around his eyes, the ones that deepened when he smiled. On the porch, I turned to say goodbye. I didn't plan it. I didn't even think. But I stepped a little closer. He did too. And then, we kissed. We kissed. It wasn't a kiss of passion or desperation. It wasn't hurried or stolen. It was gentle, intentional. A meeting of 2 people who had not been touched, really touched, in far too long. When I pulled away, I felt breathless, but not from the kiss itself. From the realization that I had crossed a boundary I didn't even know I was capable of stepping over. "I'm sorry," I said quickly, instinctively. But he shook his head. "Don't be." I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded and walked to my car. My hands were shaking when I turned the key in the ignition. The radio came on, loud and disjointed. I turned it off immediately. The drive home felt like drifting through a fog. The roads were the same, the signs familiar, but nothing looked quite like it had that morning. My world was tilted, even if only slightly. I parked, walked into the house, and went straight to the bathroom. I looked at myself in the mirror. Same hair. Same face. But my eyes were different. Brighter, maybe. Or guilty. I couldn't decide. My phone buzzed. A message from my husband. "Boarding now. Will call when I land." I stared at the screen. My chest tightened. I typed a reply, "Safe flight." But I didn't send it. Instead, I put the phone down and walked to the kitchen. I needed air. Or maybe just silence. I opened the window above the sink and stood there, hands on the edge, breathing in the late evening breeze. A bird chirped in the distance. The scent of someone grilling 2 houses down drifted through the air. Ordinary things, in an ordinary world. And yet, nothing felt ordinary anymore. Later that night, lying in bed, I tried to justify it. To frame it as a mistake born from loneliness. A moment of weakness. But the truth was, it hadn't felt like a mistake. It had felt real. And that, more than anything, terrified me. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept turning from one side to the other, sheets twisting around my legs like reminders of what I had done. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, not my husband's, but his father's. The way he had looked at me afterward, not with shame or regret, but with something quiet, almost solemn. Like he understood the weight of the moment better than I did. In the morning, the world looked the same, but I didn't feel like the same person. I moved slower, more cautiously, as though someone might see something written on my face, something that would give me away. I drank my coffee in silence, watching the steam rise and disappear, wondering if guilt was supposed to feel like this. Heavy, but hollow. The house was still. Not just quiet, still. Like time had paused here, waiting for something to be acknowledged. I walked through the rooms without purpose, trailing my fingers along the backs of chairs and the cold edge of the kitchen counter. Everything around me was familiar, yet nothing felt like it belonged to me anymore. Around noon, I got a call from my husband. He wanted to check in, asked if I needed anything from duty-free, told me he'd be home the next evening. I answered every question with polite tones, kept my voice even, made sure I sounded normal. The more normal I sounded, the more I felt like a stranger in my own skin. When we hung up, I stood there holding the phone, staring at the blank screen. I told myself to breathe. In. Out. In. Out. But nothing settled inside me. Later that day, I found myself rearranging the books in the living room, something I hadn't done in years. It wasn't about cleaning. It was about control. About touching things that didn't talk back, didn't judge, didn't remember. I alphabetized them, then reversed the order by author's first name. Anything to stay busy. But the space between tasks felt like it was expanding. Minutes stretched. The day moved like cold honey. In the evening, I stood in front of my closet for a long time. I wasn't going anywhere, but I couldn't stop looking at my clothes. My eyes landed on a deep green blouse I hadn't worn in months. I took it off the hanger and pressed it to my body in front of the mirror. It hugged me in the right places, brought out the warmth in my skin. I didn't put it on, just held it there, wondering who I was dressing for anymore. Memories of yesterday flickered in and out like static. The warmth of his hand. The quiet way he had said, "Don't be sorry." That small, steady moment before the kiss, and the way nothing had rushed afterward. There was no drama, no declarations. Just two people, quietly crossing a line neither had spoken of. I made dinner but barely ate. Stirred pasta absently in the pot, left it on the stove untouched. My appetite had vanished, replaced by a dense pressure in my chest I couldn't name. It wasn't regret. It wasn't satisfaction either. It was something in between, a stillness that vibrated beneath the surface. That night, I opened my laptop and began writing an email. I didn't know who it was meant for. Him, maybe. Myself. The subject line was blank. The message started, "I don't know what this means. But I know it means something." I stared at the sentence for a long time, then deleted it. Closed the laptop. Walked away. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in months. I went for a walk without headphones, without a destination. The air was crisp, sun low in the sky. I passed familiar houses, smiled at a dog behind a fence, waved to a neighbor I hadn't spoken to in years. Everything looked as it always had. But inside me, something had shifted. When I came back, I found an envelope in the mailbox. My name written in careful cursive. No stamp. I knew before opening it. Inside was a folded note. Just a few lines. "If you ever want to talk, the door is open. No pressure. No expectations." I read it twice, then tucked it into the kitchen drawer with the spare batteries and expired coupons. I didn't call. I didn't text. But I thought about it every hour. The truth was, I didn't know what I wanted. Not fully. I didn't know if I wanted more, or if I just wanted to be seen again. Noticed. Heard. The kiss had woken something in me I thought was long dead, not desire, exactly, but awareness. A sense that my life wasn't finished. That I wasn't invisible. That maybe, I didn't have to keep living in a marriage where silence had become the third person in the room. But I also knew the consequences. Not just for me, but for everyone. My husband. My son. Him. I began to carry that weight differently. Not with panic, but with calculation. I stopped trying to pretend nothing had happened, at least not to myself. I started asking harder questions, not out loud, but in the mirror, in the moments just before sleep. Do I still love my husband? When did I stop feeling safe with him? Is this betrayal worse because of who it was with, or because it revealed how numb I had become? The answers didn't come easily. Sometimes they didn't come at all. But they started to surface, one layer at a time. I didn't see him again that week. But I thought about him constantly. Not romantically, not lustfully. Just, with quiet intensity. Like a question that refuses to be ignored. At night, I lay beside my husband, now home, tired, distracted, and wondered how many times he had turned away from me without realizing it. How many chances we'd had to reconnect, and let them slip through the cracks of busy schedules and unread messages. He asked how I'd been. I told him, fine. He believed me. And maybe that was the saddest part. The house was unusually bright that morning. Sunlight poured in through the kitchen windows, catching the dust in the air and making everything look golden for a moment. I stood there for a long time, staring at the light, thinking how strange it was that something so ordinary could feel so unfamiliar. It wasn't the light that had changed. It was me. My husband sat across from me at the table, scrolling through emails on his phone while sipping his coffee. He had come home the night before, kissed my cheek, unpacked in silence. Nothing seemed different for him. Or maybe he was just pretending not to notice anything, the way I had learned to pretend for years. We exchanged a few polite words, plans for the weekend, groceries that needed picking up, a reminder about the car service. It was all routine. Scripted. Safe. But inside me, nothing felt safe anymore. I watched him talk and realized I couldn't remember the last time I had studied his face this closely. The lines on his forehead had deepened. His hair had more gray than I remembered. He looked tired. Not just physically, but in the way that comes from years of quiet resignation. I wondered if he felt the same way about me. Later that day, I found myself walking through the local farmer's market, pretending to care about fresh produce. The noise and color around me were a welcome distraction, but it didn't quiet the storm in my head. I picked up apples I didn't need, nodded politely at familiar faces, and kept walking until I realized I was nowhere near where I meant to be. Somehow, my steps had led me toward the edge of town, to the little used bookstore near the river. It was one of those places that always smelled like dust and paper and comfort. I hadn't been there in months. I walked inside without thinking. The bell over the door gave a tired jingle, and the woman behind the counter barely looked up. That suited me just fine. I wandered through the aisles, fingers trailing the spines of old hardcovers, eyes flickering over forgotten titles. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I just wanted to feel something, even if it was only the weight of a book in my hands. In the back corner, where the poetry section met travel guides, I stopped. A copy of a novel I once loved was propped up, its cover worn, pages yellowed. I picked it up, flipped through the first few pages, and smiled despite myself. The words felt like they were reaching back to a version of me I had long since buried. I bought the book and stepped outside into the sunlight, clutching it like a lifeline. On the way home, I saw him. He was sitting alone on a bench outside the small coffee shop, reading a newspaper, a half-drunk cup of tea beside him. He hadn't seen me. I could have kept walking. I should have. But I didn't. I stood there for a moment, half hidden by a flowering tree, watching him. There was a calmness about him that drew me in, the kind of stillness that doesn't demand attention but earns it anyway. He looked up suddenly, as if sensing eyes on him. Our gazes met. He didn't smile. Neither did I. But we both knew. I crossed the street slowly, my heart knocking against my ribs like it had something urgent to say. He stood as I approached, ever the gentleman, even now. We didn't greet each other. We didn't need to. He gestured toward the walking path by the river, and I nodded. We walked in silence at first, the sound of gravel underfoot filling the space between us. The river shimmered beside us, its surface broken only by the occasional duck or falling leaf. I didn't expect to see you, I said finally. Neither did I, he replied. I told him I had just come from the bookstore, held up the novel as if it explained everything. He nodded. I always liked that one. We kept walking. The conversation was light, safe again. Books. Weather. A nearby bakery that had closed. But under it all, there was an unspoken current, pulling us closer. At one point, he stopped and looked out over the water. Do you ever wonder how you got here? He asked. I didn't answer right away. I knew he didn't mean geographically. Yes, I said. All the time. He nodded, but didn't say anything else. I wanted to ask if he regretted it, the kiss, the moment, all of it. I wanted to ask if he thought about it as much as I did. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I said, things at home feel heavier now. He looked at me. Because of what happened? I shook my head. Because of everything that hasn't. That made him pause. He looked down at his hands, then back at me. Sometimes it's the silence that breaks you, he said softly. We walked a bit further, then turned back. Neither of us suggested another meeting. Neither of us needed to. When I got home, the house felt darker, even though the sun hadn't set. I put the book on the coffee table and stared at it. Then I went to the kitchen and made tea, standing by the window as the kettle boiled. My husband was in the living room, watching something on his laptop with his headphones in. I watched him for a moment, the curve of his shoulders, the set of his jaw. I wondered what he would say if he knew. If he suspected. If he even cared. Later, as I got ready for bed, I found myself reaching for the green blouse again. I held it against me like I had before, but this time it felt different. Not like a question, but like a reminder. I wasn't invisible. I wasn't finished. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel ashamed of wanting more. The next few days passed like mist, not quite real, not quite forgettable. I went through the motions of my life with the kind of practiced ease that only long years of habit could teach. The morning routine with my husband returned to its usual rhythm: coffee, news, half-formed conversations about headlines or errands, punctuated by the occasional question about dinner. On the surface, everything seemed as it had always been. But underneath, I could feel something trembling. Not guilt. Not fear. Something more fragile, the sense that I was no longer in the life I had built, but somewhere just beside it. It was during one of these mornings, while folding laundry, that I found it, a scarf I hadn't seen in months. Deep burgundy, soft as breath, folded in the back of the closet behind winter coats. It still carried a faint trace of perfume, one I used to wear before I decided I didn't need to impress anyone. I held it for a moment, then wrapped it loosely around my neck, not because of the chill, but because of what it made me feel, present. That same afternoon, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened the door and found a small package on the welcome mat, no return address. Inside was a book of poetry, with a note tucked between the pages. Thought of you when I read this, it said. No name. But I didn't need one. I sat on the couch, turned to a random page, and began to read. The words reached a part of me I'd been ignoring for years, the part that longed not just to be noticed, but to be understood. There was one line that stayed with me, *, the silence between words can be the loudest confession. *, I read it again and again until it became a whisper echoing in my thoughts. By evening, I had made a decision. I told my husband I was going to drop off something at a friend's place. He nodded without looking up from his laptop. I changed into something simple, not glamorous, not deliberately casual, just something that felt like me. A blouse I hadn't worn in ages. Jeans that fit well but didn't ask for attention. And that scarf. I drove without music. The silence felt sharper than any melody. When I pulled into the driveway, the porch light was already on. He opened the door before I knocked, as though he had been waiting. We stood there for a moment, saying nothing. Then he stepped aside, and I walked in. The air inside was warm, filled with the scent of something baked, maybe cinnamon or nutmeg. I didn't ask. He offered me tea, and I accepted. Everything about the moment felt grounded, unforced. We sat in the living room, mugs in hand, and began to talk. Not about us, not directly, but about time. About how quickly it moved when we weren't looking. About the little things we missed when we focused too hard on the big ones. About music from 20 years ago, about his late wife's laugh, about how certain memories lose their shape but never their weight. Somewhere in the middle of that conversation, our hands brushed. Just once. Light. Unintentional. But electric in its softness. Neither of us commented on it. We just let the moment pass and linger in the space between words. I looked over at him, and he met my gaze. I didn't need to ask what he was thinking. I could see it in the way his eyes softened, in the way he exhaled, like he was letting go of something he'd been holding too tightly. We kissed. We kissed. No explanations. No promises. Just two people stepping once more across that invisible line. When we pulled apart, there was no need to fill the silence. It was full enough. We sat like that for a while, quiet, close. I sipped the last of my tea, now lukewarm, and glanced at the clock. Too much time had passed. I should go, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, but didn't move. I stood, walked to the door, then paused. Thank you, I said. For what? He asked. For seeing me. Back in the car, I didn't turn the engine on right away. I sat in the stillness, listening to the ticking of the cooling engine, my fingers tracing the seam of the steering wheel. I wasn't sure what I was thanking him for, the moment, the truth, or the reflection he had offered without meaning to. But it felt necessary. When I returned home, the house was dark. My husband was already in bed, his steady breathing filling the room. I undressed in silence, placed the scarf gently over the back of the chair, and climbed into bed. I stared at the ceiling for a long time. There was no regret. No elation either. Just a strange kind of clarity. A recognition that I had done something irreversible, not just in action, but in thought. That the world I had lived in was no longer mine in the same way. I reached for the pillow, pulled it closer, and closed my eyes. Sleep came slowly. And when it did, it brought no dreams, only a deep, motionless quiet, like the pause between heartbeats. The morning after felt disorienting in its simplicity. I woke up to the same dull light filtering through the curtains, the same hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, and the same quiet rustle of my husband dressing for the day. He was already up, already moving through his routines, already lost in whatever meeting or task awaited him. I stayed in bed a little longer than usual. Not out of tiredness, but out of something else, a strange sense of dislocation. My body was here, but my thoughts were scattered, pulled in different directions by the choices I'd made and the truths I wasn't ready to face. Downstairs, he poured coffee for both of us, like he always did. The gesture, once appreciated, now felt like a performance we were both pretending still mattered. He asked me if I had anything planned for the day. I said, not much. He nodded, then reminded me he had a call at noon and might need some quiet. I smiled, said of course, and sipped the coffee like everything was normal. But nothing was normal. After he left for the office, I wandered the house aimlessly. I cleaned the kitchen, though it was already clean. I reorganized the spice rack, wiped down the baseboards, polished the dining table. I even watered plants that didn't need watering. My hands were busy, but my mind remained loud. Around midday, I sat down in the living room with the poetry book still lying on the coffee table. I opened to the same line I had read days ago, *, the silence between words can be the loudest confession. * this time, I let the meaning settle deeper. I thought about all the silences I had lived in. All the confessions I hadn't spoken. All the moments where I had chosen stillness over truth. I closed the book and stood, drawn to the window. Outside, the sun filtered through the trees in a soft, golden haze. The world looked calm, unaware of the storm I carried. An hour passed. Maybe more. Then I found myself in the bedroom, pulling out the scarf again, the burgundy one. I held it for a moment, then folded it carefully and placed it in my bag. I didn't have a plan. Just a feeling. I walked out the door and let my feet carry me. It wasn't until I saw the building that I realized where I was going. His house. Not far. Not hidden. Just there. As if waiting. I didn't knock this time. I hesitated on the steps, unsure if I should be there. But before I could make a decision, the door opened. He stood there, surprised but not shocked. We looked at each other for a moment, then I spoke. Do you have a few minutes? He stepped aside. Always. Inside, the house smelled like lemon and cedarwood, fresh, lived in, warm. He had been baking something again, but didn't mention it. I sat down in the same chair I had the last time, and he brought me tea without asking what kind I wanted. We didn't speak at first. We just sat there, each of us staring into the middle distance, lost in thoughts that neither of us knew how to shape into words. Finally, I broke the silence. I don't know what I'm doing. He nodded slowly, not pressing, not prompting. I keep thinking it was a mistake, I continued. And then I think it wasn't. He looked at me then, his eyes soft. Maybe it was both. That answer felt more honest than anything else could have. I nodded. We talked for a while after that. Nothing dramatic. Just small reflections, how odd it felt to be at this stage of life, still uncertain. How difficult it was to find joy in places that had once been familiar. How we both sometimes felt like we were living as echoes of who we used to be. He didn't try to convince me of anything. He didn't try to define what we were or what we had done. He just listened. And that, somehow, was enough. Before I left, I reached into my bag and handed him the scarf. I found it the other day, I said. Thought maybe you'd like to hold on to it for a while. He took it, turning it over in his hands, as if it were fragile. Thank you. There was a pause, a kind of invisible question hanging in the air between us. But neither of us asked it. Back home, the house was quiet again. My husband's voice drifted from the office, something about deadlines and deliverables. I stood in the hallway, listening to him speak to a world I was no longer a part of. Not truly. Not in the way I used to be. That night, he asked me if I wanted to go away with him for the weekend. Just us, he said. Like we used to. I hesitated. Where? Somewhere quiet. Doesn't matter. Just thought it might be good. We haven't done that in a while. I nodded slowly. Okay. Maybe. He smiled, as if relieved. Then returned to his emails. In bed, I stared at the ceiling again, like I'd done so many times. I thought about the river path. The porch light. The scarf. The tea. The way he said always, without needing to explain. I thought about how little it takes to feel noticed, and how rarely we allow ourselves to want it. I didn't sleep much that night. But for once, I wasn't afraid of what I was becoming. Only of what I might still choose. It started as a lie, small and ordinary, the kind that slips off the tongue without effort. My husband had asked me what my plans were for the evening, and I told him I was meeting a friend from my book club. It wasn't even a clever lie, and I didn't dress it up with detail. He nodded, barely listening, absorbed in some report on his tablet, and said, "Okay, don't be too late." That was it. I stood there for a few seconds longer than necessary, waiting, maybe for a question, a glance, a hesitation. But none came. I left the house with my heart beating louder than usual, my breath shallow in the cool evening air. I had rehearsed nothing, made no promises to myself, but my body moved with a certainty my mind could no longer pretend to fight. The drive was quiet. I didn't play music. The hum of the tires on the asphalt became a rhythm I could follow, a background pulse to my racing thoughts. I told myself it was just dinner. Just company. Just comfort. But I knew that wasn't true, not fully. And that made it harder. When I arrived, the house was softly lit, warm from within, like it had been expecting me. I parked the car a little farther down the road this time, out of habit maybe, or fear. I wasn't sure. I hesitated on the sidewalk, looking up at the window. It was open slightly, curtains moving gently in the breeze. I imagined him inside, setting the table or boiling water. I took a breath and walked to the door. He opened it before I could knock. Neither of us spoke. We simply looked at each other. I could tell from his face that he knew, he understood what this evening was and what it wasn't. There was no performance between us. No act of pretending it was all casual. He stepped back. I entered. The living room was calm. A faint trace of rosemary in the air, something baking in the kitchen. The record player hummed in the corner, playing something soft, not jazz, not classical, just quiet. The kind of music you don't notice until you do. We sat down with tea first. The way people do when they're stalling. When they're aware of the space between them and not ready to close it. We talked, briefly, about the weather, the grocery store that had closed down, a news article he'd read. But our words were thin, placeholders for everything we weren't saying. Eventually, the conversation slowed to a stop. The pauses became longer. The silence is more full. Then, slowly, he reached for my hand. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. Just his fingers, lightly brushing mine. I looked down at them, then at him. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. We spent the night together. There's not much else to say about it, not in the way that people expect. There were no fireworks, no declarations. No cinematic fade to black. Only two people sharing a space they never imagined they would, a space full of memory, fear, tenderness, and something deeper. Something quieter. In the morning, I woke to the scent of coffee and the sound of birds outside the window. The light was soft, the the kind that fills a room without asking permission. I sat up slowly, unsure of what to feel. He was in the kitchen, moving about with quiet care. I watched him from the hallway for a moment, his back turned, the gentleness in his movements so unfamiliar compared to the clipped, efficient rhythm of my husband. It wasn't better. It wasn't worse. It was simply different. And that, in itself, was profound. He saw me and smiled, not with expectation, not with triumph, but with something closer to understanding. Like he knew I was carrying a weight, and he wasn't going to pretend to take it from me. We sat across from each other at the table, drinking coffee, the silence between us soft rather than strained. I wrapped my hands around the cup, searching for warmth, for grounding. "I don't know what happens now," I said finally. "I didn't expect you to," he replied. And that was all. No questions. No demands. Just truth, laid bare and simple. I left soon after, before the morning grew too bright, before the outside world could demand explanations I didn't have. The drive back was different than the one before, not heavier, not lighter. Just slower. More aware. Back home, the house was still. My husband was already gone, a note on the table, meeting until late. "Dinner on your own?" I stared at the paper for a long time, the neat handwriting, the loop in his G, the way he always added a question mark as if to make it gentler. I made myself a sandwich I didn't want and sat at the kitchen table, chewing mechanically. My mind wandered back to the scarf, still with him, draped over a chair. I wondered if he had noticed the scent I'd left behind, faint but real. I wondered if he would keep it out in the open or tuck it away where no one could find it. As the afternoon turned to evening, the guilt came in waves, not just for what I'd done, but for what I had accepted. For how long I had denied myself feeling anything at all. For how much I had allowed silence to pass as peace. But the guilt wasn't clean. It was tangled with something else, a strange, aching clarity. I had crossed a line. Not just in action, but in identity. I could no longer pretend to be the version of myself who had never wondered what it might feel like to be touched gently, looked at with awareness, heard without effort. That night, I lay in bed beside my husband. His breathing was steady, a kind of metronome I had lived beside for years. I watched the ceiling, listened to the silence, and realized something that startled me with its simplicity. I didn't regret it. And maybe that was the most terrifying part of all. The next morning, I found myself moving through the house with the same practiced steps, but everything felt slightly out of place. The coffee didn't taste quite right. The floor felt colder beneath my feet. Even the light through the kitchen window seemed harsher, more revealing. As if the house itself knew. As if it had absorbed the secret and didn't know how to hold it gently. My husband was already gone. Another early meeting. Another conference call. Another note on the counter, "Don't forget we need milk." No greeting. No signature. Just the task. I stared at the note, then crumpled it and threw it in the bin without reading it a second time. I stood in the kitchen, still and quiet, waiting for something inside me to settle. But it didn't. I couldn't tell if it was guilt or grief, or something far more subtle. A recognition, maybe. That what had been done could not be undone. That the path I had chosen wasn't a detour, it was a departure. The rest of the morning passed slowly. I attempted to clean the bedroom but gave up halfway through making the bed. I stared at the half-folded sheets, the rumpled pillows, and walked out without finishing. In the hallway, my phone buzzed. A new message. It was from him. Just 3 words. "Are you okay?" I didn't reply right away. I held the phone in my hand for minutes, maybe longer. The question was simple, but it reached into a part of me that felt raw. Was I okay? I didn't know. I typed, yes. Just quiet today. He didn't respond immediately. When he did, it was only, let me know if you need anything. I stared at the screen long after the message faded. There was no pressure in his words. No expectations. Only space. And right now, space felt like a kindness I didn't deserve. I spent the afternoon trying to distract myself. I read a few pages from the book on the coffee table, made soup I didn't eat, reorganized a drawer that hadn't needed organizing. But nothing helped. My thoughts kept looping back to the same moment, the night we had spent together. The stillness of it. The closeness. The terrifying honesty of it. I knew it couldn't stay hidden forever. Even if no one found out, something inside me had already changed. A door had opened, and no matter how tightly I closed it, the air had shifted. I carried it in my breath, in the way I moved, in the way I looked at my husband without really seeing him. It was early evening when I made the mistake. I had been scrolling through old photos on my phone, mindless, nostalgic, a way to feel grounded again. I stopped at one from 3 years ago, taken at a family gathering. Everyone was there. Him. My husband. Me, smiling too hard. I stared at the image for a long time, then backed out of the album. Without thinking, I opened my messages. I typed, "Thank you for last night." I felt like myself again. I meant to send it to him. I didn't. It went to my husband. The moment I hit send, I froze. My stomach dropped. My heart lurched. I stared at the screen in horror. The words were there. Sent. Delivered. Irretrievable. Panic rose in my throat, sharp and immediate. I opened the message thread to him, the one it was meant for, and sent a single word, mistake. No explanation. No time. Within seconds, my phone vibrated again. From my husband. What is this? I didn't answer. Another message. Who is this for? I couldn't breathe. My hands shook. I stared at the phone as if it had turned into something foreign, dangerous. And then it rang. I didn't answer. It rang again. This time, I picked up. His voice was cold, flat. Tell me right now who you meant to send that to. I tried to speak, but my throat felt dry, constricted. It's not what you think, I said, and immediately hated how pathetic it sounded. He laughed once, short, humorless. You think I'm stupid? No, I whispered. I don't know what to say. Say the truth, he said. Or don't say anything. But don't lie. Not now. I closed my eyes. It was a mistake. Yeah, he said. I know. I just didn't realize how big of one. He hung up. I sat down on the edge of the couch, phone still in my hand, the silence in the room suddenly louder than anything I had ever known. My hands trembled in my lap, useless. My mouth was dry. My thoughts moved in circles. I stared at the floor, willing it to open, to swallow me, to make this moment vanish. But it didn't. And I couldn't. I don't know how much time passed before the next message came. From him. Is everything okay? I typed a reply, then erased it. Then typed again. He knows. The dots on the screen danced, then stopped. Then started again. I'm sorry. I looked at the message, and for the first time all day, I felt something break open inside me. A kind of quiet collapse. Not a scream. Not a cry. Just a folding inward. I curled into myself on the couch, phone face down beside me, and stared at the wall until the sun disappeared. I didn't turn on any lights. I didn't move. I just sat in the dark, alone. Eventually, I heard the front door. He came in. My husband. I stood, heart pounding, ready to say something, anything. But he didn't speak. He walked past me, his eyes unreadable, his steps deliberate. He disappeared into the bedroom and closed the door behind him. That was it. No shouting. No questions. Just a door quietly shutting. And behind it, a silence I could no longer pretend was peace. The next morning arrived without the mercy of sleep. I had laid awake the entire night, listening to the small sounds of a house pretending nothing had changed, the hum of the refrigerator, the wind tapping at the windows, the occasional creak of the wooden frame. But everything had changed. The silence that used to be background noise now felt like a verdict. When I opened my eyes, the light through the curtains was thin and gray. It was the kind of morning that offered no comfort, only confirmation. Confirmation that the night before had happened. That the message had been sent. That he knew. The door to the bedroom remained closed. I moved through the house as quietly as I could. I made coffee out of habit, not desire. My hand shook slightly as I poured it. The mug felt too heavy in my grip. I stared at the surface of the coffee, waiting for it to tell me something I didn't already know. I didn't dare knock on the bedroom door. By mid-morning, I sat on the edge of the couch, my phone in my hand, expecting, or dreading, a message. But it remained silent. No calls. No texts. No updates. The house was still. Even the birds outside seemed muted, as if they, too, were watching, waiting. By early afternoon, I heard movement upstairs. Footsteps. A drawer opening. A closet door sliding. The kind of sounds you memorize without meaning to, domestic, ordinary, final. I didn't move. The sound of a suitcase unzipping reached me, soft but unmistakable. Then the shuffling of clothes being folded. A rhythm to the packing, methodical and quiet, like someone who'd already made up their mind. Still, I said nothing. A half hour later, he came down the stairs. He was dressed neatly, nothing dramatic, just jeans and a sweater, his travel bag in hand. His face was unreadable. Not angry. Not emotional. Just blank, like a page someone had wiped clean. I stood as he entered the room, heart pounding in my chest. He paused in the doorway, eyes flicking to mine briefly before settling somewhere just past my shoulder. He didn't sit. Didn't put the bag down. Just stood there. "I'm going to stay at my sister's," he said. His voice was low, even. I opened my mouth to speak, but he held up a hand, not sharply, not unkindly. Just enough to stop the moment before it unraveled. "I don't want to hear explanations right now," he said. "Not today. Maybe not ever." The words hit harder than I expected. Not in their sharpness, but in their calm. I nodded. It was all I could manage. He turned to leave, then stopped at the door. Whatever this was, whoever he is. I just hope it was worth it. Then he walked out, and the door clicked shut behind him. The silence that followed wasn't just absence. It was something deeper. A severing. The sound of a life breaking into two distinct halves, the before and the after. I sat down slowly, hands in my lap, staring at the spot where he had stood. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. I reached for it, already knowing who it was. I heard what happened. "Are you okay?" I stared at the message, unsure how to answer. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to lie, to simplify it. But there was no simplicity left. "I don't know," I typed. He responded quickly. "Do you want to talk?" I didn't. But I typed yes. A few hours later, I found myself sitting in his living room again. The same chair. The same quiet hum of music in the background. But the energy between us had changed. Not colder. Not distant. Just heavier. Weighted by consequence. He brought me tea again, and we sat without speaking. Finally, I said, he left. He nodded. I know. I'm sorry. I'm not sure if I am, I whispered, and surprised myself. We sat in silence for a long time. I told him everything. Not the physical details. But the emotions. The years of loneliness. The quiet resentment. The way I had become invisible even to myself. The slow unraveling of a life that had once felt full but had narrowed into a series of tasks and obligations. He listened without interruption, his face soft, steady. I don't know who I am now, I said. I only know who I'm not. I think that's a start, he replied. I stayed for a while. We didn't talk much after that. Just sat together. No touch. No expectation. Just presence. A kind of shared recognition. When I left, the air outside had turned cool, a soft wind brushing against my face as I walked to the car. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the street. I looked back once, at the house, at the light in the window, then drove away. I didn't go home right away. I drove aimlessly, windows down, letting the wind thread through my hair. The town blurred around me, familiar streets now slightly unfamiliar, as if rearranged overnight. Eventually, I parked near the water. The river moved slowly, the surface catching the last bits of light. I sat on a bench and watched it, remembering the earlier days. The walks. The talks. The feeling of awakening. The terrifying freedom of it all. I thought of my husband, now not my husband, not really. I thought of the years we had shared. The routines we had built. The love that had once been real. The comfort that had turned into complacency. I didn't hate him. I wasn't angry. But I knew now that I had stopped being his wife long before the kiss. I had simply forgotten to leave. I didn't cry. I didn't break down. I just sat there, letting the evening wrap around me like a blanket. Eventually, I stood, walked back to the car, and drove home. The house was dark. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. There was no one to greet. No dinner waiting. No note on the counter. Just me. And maybe, for the first time in a long time, that was enough.